Paper was like gold in medieval times.
Oh, not tobacco, sugar.
That everything we thought we knew about the world might turn out to be completely wrong.
But if you would tell me who I am, at least take the trouble to discover what I have been.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream.
Ida B. Wells' activism really stems from her career as a journalist. And she began to raise the question about why lynching occurred in the South, and particularly to challenge the stereotype of lynching being a result of African-American men raping white women.
In the early 1900s, major Hollywood film companies portrayed African Americans through negative stereotypes. White performers were made up in blackface. The goal was to create the impression that African Americans were inferior. These movies increased racial hatred and were a factor in sporadic racial rioting and lynchings of this period.
Blacks had been depicted in movies, in books, and basically in the public media as beasts, as individuals that were on the edges or fringes of barbarism, individuals that attacked white women indiscriminately. And white men took it upon themselves to sponsor a holy crusade against blacks.
Under God, I have done work without any assistance from my own people. And when I think that I have been able to do the work with his assistance that you could not do if you would, and you would not do if you could, I think I have a right to a feeling of strong indignation. With that, I walked out of the meeting and left them sitting with their mouths open.
Blacks never did really have an opportunity economically to get back into mainstream America.
The end of the Civil War on April 9, 1865, also ended 246 years of slavery for over 4 million African Americans under oppression by white power. Legally stopped from education and economic opportunities under captivity, the race moved swiftly to take advantage of new rights extended under the Constitution. President Abraham Lincoln and Congress passed landmark legislation.
One of the things that we'll find is that Lincoln, in his Emancipation Proclamation, was definitely paying attention to not offending the South, but at the same time ridding the nation of that stain of black slavery.
But Southern states, however, resented this new black equality and worked to undermine national laws during this period known as Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1875. Hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged and used violent methods such as lynching to discourage African Americans from exercising their new rights. The race was voting in large numbers to elect legislators that delivered benefits in their neighborhoods. But white Southern racists were fearful that African Americans would gain too much political and economic power. So they took steps, often violent, to take the vote and suppress freedom. African Americans who dared to vote were injured or murdered. But this didn't frighten them off. They kept voting to elect men like Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, who served as state senator and lieutenant governor of Louisiana during Reconstruction.
One of the things that blacks found was that even though they had been given rights by the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, they found that the Supreme Court, this time the highest court in the land, is really not committed to effectively give blacks or to assure that blacks have these opportunities.
The national government ignored these blatant violations against African Americans. Rights that the race had earned were taken away by 1900 in the South. Frequent violence against them grew. It became commonplace. Racist white mobs went on killing sprees, murdering unarmed African American men, women, and children. Lynching happened so often that it became an accepted reality in African American life. The perpetrators were not stopped by legal authorities at the state or federal levels.
Ida B. Wells, born into slavery, rose to challenge this brutality, and her work brought worldwide attention to the lynching issue. Born July 16, 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi, she was the oldest of 8 children. Her parents, both former slaves, strongly stressed education and self-esteem to their children. Because of this kind of nurturing, Wells had a great thirst for knowledge. She graduated from Rust College in Holly Springs and stretched herself by taking extra classes whenever she could to sharpen her skills. After passing the teaching test by the fall of 1884, Wells was teaching in Memphis city schools. She also wrote for a church paper, and her talents attracted the attention of the Free Speech newspaper. They made her an offer to be an editor, and she accepted. Her brief teaching career ended in 1891 when Wells was fired in the all-black Memphis school system for writing an article in the Free Speech that criticized the poor conditions for students. After being dismissed, she started writing full-time, and she saved what she could to buy an interest in the newspaper. Traveling on one of her regular trips for subscribers in Natchez, Mississippi in 1892, she heard about another horrible lynching in Memphis. This time, 3 African-American males who owned a business had been murdered by a white mob. They were close friends of Wells. During this era, African-Americans who dared to go into business risked being killed. In Memphis, Wells inspired African-Americans to pack up, and this caused the white-owned streetcar system to lose large sums of money because ridership was low. 2 city railroad company representatives visited Wells in her office and asked her for help at getting African Americans to ride. Wells refused.
Her press was destroyed and a threat was on her life to return back to Memphis. So African American women came to her aid in terms of helping her to stay in Philadelphia, New York. T. Thomas Fortune came to her aid by giving her a job with the New York Age. One of the things that she said was, or to raise the question, was it really bound around rape, or was it about economics? And when she begins to question the fact that whites want to keep blacks economically bound, she becomes a victim of racism herself. And as she begins to go around the country speaking about it, it got to the point where she could not come home. And as she went abroad to talk about lynching, it got to the point whereby even white journalists in America organized a campaign against her to tell, particularly audiences in Europe, that what she was saying was a lie, that black folks at home lynched, they stole, they raped, etc. So lynching was a necessity.
Although Wells was not covered by the white papers in the North, she pressed ahead, and more invitations to speak followed. Her persistence paid off. In 1893, Wells was invited to England through contacts she'd made at speaking engagements. She spent April and May there, her first trip abroad. Wells received large levels of support. Speaking invitations flowed in, more than she could accept. Before her visit, many influential people told her they thought the negative reports about African Americans were true. A wide range of English religious leaders showed evidence of their support by signing resolutions that strongly condemned American lynching.
Later that year in July, she joined forces with Frederick Douglass and Ferdinand Barnett to challenge the exclusion of African Americans at the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The affair promoted cultures of the world. Wells produced and distributed several thousand pamphlets that reported that racism is why African Americans were being excluded. Only the nationally acclaimed Frederick Douglass was admitted because Haiti wanted him to be a part of their program. He invited a then struggling poet named Paul Laurence Dunbar to be his guest. At the time, Dunbar was an elevator boy. Dunbar didn't know that nationally famous journalist William Dean Howells of the Atlantic Monthly in Boston was there and had read a copy of his poetry. Howells liked his work and printed it in his publication. This proved to be Dunbar's springboard to national fame. African Americans excelled in other fields too, overcoming extraordinary obstacles. In medicine, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams received worldwide recognition in 1893 for being the first person to successfully perform open-heart surgery.
Wells returned to England in 1894 to draw more attention to the struggle. She stayed focused and garnered endorsements from leading political figures and religious groups. And by writing about her experiences abroad as a correspondent for the Inter-Ocean newspaper in Chicago, she further promoted the cause. Wells made the decision to move to Chicago primarily because of a romantic interest in Ferdinand L. Barnett. They married June 27, 1895.
Ida B. Wells married an attorney who became one of the city attorneys due to an appointment that Booker T. Washington made for him, Ferdinand Barnett. And when he became an attorney, people assumed that she would stay at home with her children, etc. Instead, she went from convention to convention, carrying her children with her, and matter of fact, nursing her children at the convention. She was able to balance, as many African American women of this period, motherhood, being a wife, as well as being an activist.
In 1895, Wells was in the national headlines again for her 3-year study on lynching, compiled in 1892, 93, and 94. Called the Red Record, it documented the lynching history that clearly showed African Americans were principal victims. The study cited that in 1894, 132 persons were executed by due process of law, but 197 persons were murdered by mobs without an opportunity for a defense. Some of these victims were white, but the majority were African Americans.
They were committed to, in fact, doing whatever they had to do by any means necessary to keep blacks in a state of dependence on the white community. What we also see is that Lincoln was really not committed to total equality of black people, as he was to often say that if he would have not had to free a single slave and end the war, he would have done that. But after he was assassinated, these radical elements in Congress felt that they should in fact take control of Reconstruction. Polling places are moved indiscriminately. Blacks are not told when they go to the polling places to exercise their franchise. They are met with guns, they are met with other threats on their families, their homes are burned. So blacks really were frightened and really intimidated by these means that whites used to, in fact, suppress them.
When she and William Monroe Trotter went to see Woodrow Wilson in 1913, the newly elected president, wanting to get the issue of injustice and especially lynching an issue on his progressive agenda. And a major confrontation broke out, and they were asked to leave, and he was very upset with the meeting.
Wells said the president claimed he wasn't aware there was segregation and told them that if they wanted to meet again, don't bring Trotter. The Associated Press News Service found out about this and sent news across the country that Trotter insulted President Wilson. African American papers copied them and knocked his actions too. The burning issue of race engulfed the nation even in the midst of World War I in 1917. While African American soldiers were fighting and dying throughout Europe for America, they were denied basic rights at home. Across the country, the race faced racial violence in the North and the South.
Ida B. Wells also created in the urban centers, there were settlement houses where young girls and young men too, when they came into the city, they could live in these houses or these particular, almost like dormitory settings. And Ida B. Wells had one in Chicago, and they had reading rooms and job bureaus and etc. So she was also instrumental in trying to help young transplants or young migrants, especially women.
She had to shut the doors in 1920 after 2 boarders stole major items. Wells' goal had been to have a facility like the Hull House started by Jane Addams in Chicago in 1893. But she wasn't able to get the help that Addams received.
This division or this lack of directions or this lack of, I would say support, I guess, for all of her efforts can be seen throughout her life, because there are prime examples when she did not have complete support of the African American community. But one of the things it never did was to stop her. She is a precursor of grassroots leadership, generally what we think of when we talk about the modern civil rights movement. I would venture to say that Ida Wells could very well be a mentor in terms of that sort of community building and community organization, being one who is really not afraid when there are not just lynchings, but when people were arrested, like in Elaine, Arkansas, when she went down, when the sharecroppers were arrested, she went to jail to find out what it was about and then to reveal to the country what was happening. So we are talking about a woman that was indeed very visible and very multifaceted in terms of trying to make sure that democracy was a reality. It's difficult to kind of peg her into any one particular role. Her most success comes from her ability to really put on the forefront the issue of lynching.
Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And it does seem to me that notwithstanding all these social agencies and activities, that there is not that vigilance which should be exercised in the preservation of our rights.